Meanwhile, the Republican ticket is doing its best to avoid a pair of damning news stories just today. The Atlantic is out today with a new article quoting more of the racist, reprehensible things Donald Trump says behind closed doors, including comments about a murdered Army private. You may remember this story. In 2020, Private Vanessa Guillen, the daughter of Mexican immigrants, was killed by another soldier at Fort Hood in Texas. And at the time, then President Donald Trump publicly offered to pay for her funeral. But when the bill came, according to this report, Trump was furious, telling his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, quote, "It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury an effing Mexican." He turned to Meadows and issued an order, "Don't pay it." Later that day, he was still agitated. "Can you believe," he said, according to a witness, "effing people trying to rip me off?" The Atlantic reports that Trump didn't pay the bill. His campaign denied he made those comments. You, of course, can make up your own mind as to whether or not that sounds like something Donald Trump would say and do. And then just literally within the last hour, breaking story from the New York Times, publishing an interview with Donald Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, where he called his former boss a fascist.
Certainly, the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
The American people will have to decide in just 14 days if that man, the one that General Mark Milley and Mr. Kelly call a fascist, if that man deserves another 4 years in the White House. New York Times investigative reporter Michael Schmidt spoke to John Kelly for this Times report, and he joins me now. Michael, tell me about your conversation with the former president's former chief of staff.
I think what's most significant here is that you can hear it in Kelly's own voice. You can hear it directly from Kelly. And I think that a lot has been written about Kelly over the years, about different things that he may have, witnessed that Trump said or did. But what's different here is that you can actually hear Kelly say it. And to me, that was really important and something we pushed really hard for, because we thought that people, should hear it from him himself, that these shouldn't be, that we needed to go further than just relaying, anecdotes and such. And that, Kelly had to, we pushed Kelly as hard as we could to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, I want to read another quote from Kelly. He says he certainly prefers the dictator approach to government, Mr. Kelly said. Mr. Trump never accepted the fact he wasn't the most powerful man in the world. And by power, I mean an ability to do anything he wanted, any time he wanted. It's quite a characterization.
You still with me there?
Yep, I got you.
Yeah, I think that, look, I think Kelly finds himself in a pretty difficult position, because I think he believes as a former uniformed military officer, he should not be weighing in on politics. As we point out in the story, he's not endorsing a candidate, saying one way or the other, but he does believe that people need to understand that fitness and character are important parts of a candidate and of what voters should consider, and that those issues may actually be even bigger than their policy stances. And he believes that Americans should have some knowledge of what he saw up close in Donald Trump, and should have some sense of who he is, how he viewed the Constitution, how he viewed the rule of law, and what he said about veterans and Hitler and other reprehensible issues.
John Kelly was parted ways with Donald Trump after first serving Secretary of Department of Homeland Security and then Chief of Staff. The line that you get from Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and their supporters is that when you hear things like what John Kelly is saying, or General Milley, that these are essentially sour grapes from disgruntled, fired employees. I wonder if you talked about that with Mr. Kelly, or what you make of that as someone who's been reporting on this for quite some time.
Well, I think that Trump's denial of calling those who died on the battlefield losers and suckers was something that really bothered Kelly. And in answering our questions, he confirmed that and talked about how Trump talked about losers and suckers and how Trump didn't understand selfless sacrifice for the country. And I think that one of the reasons that Kelly was willing to answer questions was that there was this effort to sort of undermine those anecdotes when they came out. And I think Kelly thought that, the anecdotes were true. He had put out a statement last year that confirmed the anecdotes. And I think that he hadn't appreciated the depth and breadth of the effort in 2020 when it was first revealed during the campaign to push back on it, and different Trump aides who said it wasn't true. And he went to these lengths to talk about it on the record because I think he thinks people should know about it.
Michael Schmidt, who conducted that interview with former Chief of Staff John Kelly and has a recording which is available on the New York Times website. We played you part of that. You can listen to him in his own words. Very important reporting, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Claire McCaskill is a former Democratic senator of Missouri. Al Cardenas served as the chair of Florida's Republican Party for 2 terms. This year, he endorsed and cast his vote for Kamala Harris, and they join me now. Let me start with you on that, Al, because you are amongst a group that has received a fair amount of attention, both in the campaign and in the coverage. People who are registered Republicans, people who have been Republicans most of their lives, who maybe voted for Trump before. Take me through how you ended up in the position you're in right now, which is that you're voting for and have endorsed Kamala Harris and Tim Walz.
Look, I've given Chris 4 decades of my life to build the Republican Party. And, it started out in Florida as a Democrat state. We worked hard day and night to turn it around. Never did I dream for a second that my party, my beloved party, would be where it is today. And it's dumbfounding. I remember my first campaign was with Ronald Reagan, and people were whispering within the party, hey, can we get him elected? After all, the man is divorced. Well, imagine that, being divorced, being a disqualifier for the presidency. And look where we are 40 years later. It's just a cycle in America that will embarrass our grandchildren and their children. And the quicker we can do away with it, the better. I believe that America is so divided. We don't talk amongst ourselves. We fight about nonsense. And it's all driven by the cult of one man. And I'm just taken still by what's happening. And look, as a Hispanic, I'll give you that I've got an extra reason for being so upset. And that extra reason is the fact that when I came to America, with my parents, there were signs that said no dogs, no colored, and no Cubans. And frankly, we were able to rent an efficiency because a Holocaust survivor looked at all that nonsense and said, you come and stay here. Well, I've got 5 children. They didn't have to go through what I went through because we all worked very hard to make America better and to get us from beyond that point of just racial polarization. And these comments that the president made about the burial of that fine young lady, the Hispanic, was just heartbreaking. The comments he makes about poisoning the blood of Americans, the comments he makes about mass deportations. If you're a proud Hispanic, and if you love this country as I do and as most Hispanics do, how in the world can you support this gentleman for the presidency? It's just beyond me. Well, but as a Republican and as a lover of America, beyond my own personal pet peeves, I will tell you that our country cannot be divided in this manner while the world is on fire. And we cannot survive as the leader of the world if the White House does not continue to be perceived as the place, the city, the place where the shining city on the hill is, and frankly, the resident of the White House conveys to the rest of the world the values of our country, and,
Claire,
and it just would be a disaster.
Claire, let me ask you about the comments reported from John Kelly tonight, and both in the Atlantic and in the New York Times. I mean, one of the things I sometimes try to do is put myself in a position who doesn't really pay attention to all of this and comes to American politics feeling like, well, there's all this polarization and you can find people on both sides of anything, right? Which is true, right? You can find people saying Donald Trump is, the devil incarnate, and you can find them saying he's sort of the second coming. The thing that always strikes me is how many people close to him who saw him up close have come away to say these kinds of things. He's a fascist. He should be nowhere near power. And just how rare that is. I mean, I genuinely and truly can't recount that ever happening before with almost any public figure I've ever covered.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are true with this political situation that have never been true before in America. We have never seen this kind of abandonment of a candidate by his vice president, by his chief of staff, by his secretary of defense. I mean, the majority of his cabinet have said no. And let me just say, I got to take a minute on John Kelly. I know John Kelly. I worked with John Kelly as a member of the Armed Services Committee. Yep. I worked closely with him as the ranking member on Homeland Security. He called me the day he decided to take the job as chief of staff to Donald Trump. I remember the phone call. I remember where I was. I was here in my home in St. Louis. I said, John, what are you doing? Why would you do this? And he said, I feel like I have to do it for the country. I think I can help him stay between the lines, so to speak. And when he took that job, Chris, he walked away from a military job. He still wants to be very protective of the military, but that was in essence a political job he took. So I'm so grateful he's spoken out today. I'm so grateful he's gone on tape. And if anybody doesn't believe that Donald Trump said these things, they don't know John Kelly, first of all. And second of all, we know he says these kinds of things because he said them out loud about John McCain, that he was a loser because he was a prisoner of war. So why would anyone be shocked that this is something he wouldn't say? So shame on those people who are lying for him. Good on John Kelly for speaking out, and good for great Americans like my colleague on the panel tonight that is overlooking party for country.